Let's talk about compassion as a measure in health policy. Are you the one that can get policy changed? Have you ever considered using compassion as a measure in health policy? And just imagine what our society would be like if the one measure we can never skip when analyzing a policy was compassion. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church says that those that proclaim themselves to be the sole measure of realities and of truth cannot live peacefully in society with their fellow men and women and cooperate with them. I think we all know that person that is so passionate about a topic that they've lost the ability to have a reasoned and rational and even kind, to put it mildly, discussion about the topic. We frequently see this in any discussion of abortion. People have such strong opinions that they can't even have a reasoned professional discussion about the topic without tempers flaring or without someone accusing the other one of being some horrible human being. We need to be able to get beyond that if we're ever going to have policy that does consider compassion. There are many frameworks and models that I could adopt to analyze policy. Henshaw and Grady identified 3 that work especially well for healthcare policy: data-driven policymaking, evidence-informed healthcare policy, and my preference of the 3, the policy cycle moving from issue to policy. Each of these has distinct advantages, but each of them is missing the fundamental elements of compassion and human dignity. Human dignity is something that we must consider when we are considering compassion. The policy cycle did include values and beliefs, but as we all know, many of our values are completely devoid of compassion when carefully examined. Compassion and reason should coexist in our policy making. If we are ever going to get beyond the negative influences of policy that is bought and paid for by the highest bidder, forced on the weak by the biggest policy bully, conceived by the person who gets personal success and puts that personal success in front of a well-ordered society and considers profits before people, then a broader concept of what constitutes a good policy must be considered. We must add compassion and ensure human dignity while minimizing negative influences. Maybe then we won't have to depend on reality TV to solve our teen pregnancy problems, or turn police officers into occupying forces to protect and serve. I took the policy cycle, which I thought was a good beginning, and I added into it compassion. And within compassion, I considered human dignity to be a critical piece of that compassion. So let's define the problem. Can we discuss compassion without discussing human dignity? When asked, what is human dignity? A frequently provided answer is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet we didn't ask someone to recite the Declaration of Independence to us. It doesn't appear that the representatives that signed the Declaration understood human dignity in its foundation, in our creation, in stating, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We would argue that when today many people young people would argue, oh, well, when they say men, they mean everybody. They really didn't. I mean, they really did consider men to be in a separate category, and they certainly meant white men. And so we have to consider policies and what they actually say. Why then is this not part of the intellectual reasoning process in making public policies? And why, for our entire history, have we failed to live up to these words in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if we now consider that for all people? It would seem obvious that human life is sacred and that there is inherent dignity in all humans. However, a quick look at public policy, media, and even individual human actions reveals that it is not at all obvious that life is treated as sacred, or that there is inherent dignity in all humans. One only needs to ask what it means to respect life, and a heated debate may ensue, with all parties proclaiming to be the sole holder of truth. Most such discussions never proceed beyond abortion, the death penalty, war, and guns, and we lose our audience. What are the social and political freedoms to which we are all entitled? Certainly, we are all entitled to liberty. And what is it? Is it life? Is it freedom of religion? Freedom of association? Freedom of speech? Is it freedom to practice to the extent of one's training and education without hindrance from another? If we examine our view of liberty and even justice, are we open to recognizing when our views impinge on the freedoms of others? So we need to ask ourselves, do we really want our liberties to be equal? And if so, why are we putting policies in place that do not ensure equality? What are our values and what are our beliefs? And how do those values and beliefs impact not only the policies that our representatives, our elected officials put in place, but our willingness to stand up and to say when we think a policy is unjust or is lacking in liberty for all, lacking in compassion, and lacking respect for human dignity. To name a few, and these are a list of some of the topics that lead to heated conversations. But with each of these policies, they end or shorten life when they are not adequately written or adequately enforced. All of these either prevent, end, or shorten seriously life or the quality of life. There is no public consensus on how to address any of these issues. In fact, within the last year, each resulted in someone trying to justify their actions and or imply that this was self-inflicted. People choose not to have health insurance, and so therefore they didn't get the life-saving care that they needed. People chose not to get a college education, and therefore they're in poverty. People chose to use drugs or drink alcohol. They chose to have sex outside of marriage and unprotected sex, and so they had the abortion. They chose to overeat, and so they are obese. You can say that any one of these resulted from a choice of an individual, but certainly every one of them also was impacted by a policy. Ask, what would compassionate policy look like related to these topics? The next time someone asks you if you are pro-life or if you are pro-gun, be sure to consider whether life is sacred and whether it is the foundation of your moral vision of society. We can only protect human dignity and have a healthy community if we protect human rights and fulfill our responsibilities to each other. We cannot shrug off poverty because it will always exist and ignore our responsibility to the poor and proclaim to be pro-life or respectful of human choice or a believer of equality. We cannot justify rape because the vagina was not ripped to shreds, or the person didn't fight back hard enough, and claim to believe in human dignity. We cannot let our children be murdered or sexually assaulted, or cover up the same and claim to believe in liberty and in human dignity. We cannot turn a blind eye to sex trafficking and claim to believe in human dignity and in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We cannot fulfill our responsibility without first recognizing the value of sharing ideas, cooperating to advance policy that supports human dignity, and admitting that no one individual is the sole purveyor of truth. Let's start with compassionate discussion. We must find a way to speak about a policy that can engage those that profess common sense without the educational training to fully grasp how policy is made, and do so in a compassionate manner. Compassionate discussion requires breaking down the issues and speaking at multiple levels. I do not speak to the person without a high school education in the same way I speak to a physician or to a lawyer, because the truth of the matter is that person isn't going to understand what I'm saying. So I have to say it in a way that I can be heard and understood. Until we can do this successfully, we will remain a divided country in which those that are rhetorically skilled will take advantage of those that are not. Once we learn to speak with compassion, we must assure that any policy analysis includes a test for compassion. So let's consider some examples. Does how we talk about policy change the tone of the conversation? If, for example, we wanted to talk about gun violence. So this is one example we can begin with. And maybe later I will do a video where we discuss a different topic. Let's consider that our premise is that reducing gun ownership will reduce deaths associated with guns. This is a premise. It's not saying that it is absolutely accurate. We don't know for sure yet. We're just saying this is our premise. There would be 6 steps to consider the morality then of gun ownership. The steps would be to gather the information on injuries and deaths related to firearms, identify the ethical problem. The ethical dilemma was between the individual right or good versus that of the community rights or goods. To consider what approaches can I utilize to analyze the problem. And then after gathering the information, determining the moral dilemma and using a framework to logically examine the problem. So, the next thing I would do is act, and then finally evaluate the process and outcomes. Those that proclaim themselves, remember, those that proclaim themselves to be the sole arbiters of truth. We can't be that person in this case. Each of us man and woman, young and old, of all races, nationalities, religions, and abilities, is meant to exercise stewardship over what is our community. We all have a responsibility to our community. I may personally believe that I should decline the right to bear arms. I may consider it, like faith, a moral decision that I will make. But it does not necessarily always mean that it is the decision everyone will make, or that they haven't well considered their arguments. Personally, I've never owned a firearm, though I grew up in a household with firearms of various kinds. Everything from the Derringer my mother carried in her purse, to the rifle that my father brought home from World War II. There were guns in every room of the house, and a reloading station in the basement. I knew how to use them and how to load my own rounds. I learned to shoot a gun at a young age and then learned about guns in greater detail when I was at FLETC. My father, who was an NRA member, never understood why I was opposed to guns. But I had my reasons and my rationale. And largely, like many people, it came from personal experiences and negative experiences with them. You have to fill in your own blanks for the things that drive you to believe in a policy or not to believe in a policy. And usually when we're passionate about something, we have incidents in our lives that have led us to that passion. The next thing you want to do is you want to gather the evidence. Any of us can rationalize why we're making the decisions we make. There can be a rationalization for owning a gun. You are a hunter. You like hunting. You need it to defend yourself and your family. You fear the government, which I might add I think is paranoid. But that being said, there are people that do. Whatever the stated reason, one must consider whether the purchase of a gun to achieve the end is morally right. Is it a compassionate choice? Because the choice you're making will influence how you look at policy. Do the circumstances, living in a dangerous neighborhood, traveling alone in an unsafe neighborhood, going to school, affect the act? So people will give various reasons for wanting a gun. They list the benign as a desire to go hunting. Some genuinely claim a need to defend themselves, and there is no doubt that some people do live in dangerous neighborhoods. And as I said, the only group I really consider to be on the paranoid side and that there is no way to have a rational discussion is people that believe they need to own guns because of the fear of the government. The more I deliberate, the more I tend to reflect then on my personal faith beliefs. And that you have heard that it was said that people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister is answerable. So the question is it enough to say that I'm owning a gun for self-protection? That's a moral decision each person will make in this country. But when we make policies, we must look beyond our personal beliefs. Remember, part of policy is the policy feasible? But what I'm asking us to consider is whether or not a policy is compassionate or not. So the next thing we could do is identify the ethical problems. And we can certainly look at guns that are sometimes used for self-defense. In 2015, at the last time I looked, 922 times guns were used for self-defense. But in the same year, there were over 40,000 gun incidents. Of those, 922 were for self-defense. Now, the question is, if you're the person that was defending themselves, then you might say, but isn't my life of value? But what do you then say to the other 40,000? How do we find a common ground where you have rational ownership, rational regulations, rational training, and yet we cut down on that number of 40,000? Is the fear one person has for his or her safety more important than the safety of those around who are, by all evidence, at greater risk due to the presence of a gun? People can cite urban versus rural statistics, or this city versus that city, but the reality is we are one nation. And as one nation, the only way we're truly going to know the answer to this is if we look at the data and the information, and we have a standardized way we're collecting information on gun-related incidents, so that it's not a not-for-profit that's having to do it one way and another not-for-profit that's doing it another, or an advocacy group that's collecting data, but that we have a standardized measure. The next thing is we need to analyze the problem. And I try to think of problems in terms of what we do before a crisis occurs, what we do during the crisis, and what we do after the crisis. So if we considered gun violence the crisis, then we need to identify potential coping mechanisms related to the fear of violence. We need preparedness training, and we need licensing and monitoring. For the environment, we need to look at potential areas of violence, risk communication, evacuation plans, shelter in place, active shooter plans. We can look at any model, and this is a model I'm looking at, to try to reduce the incidence. I first approach the problem from a veil of ignorance, which is to say, if I were this person who was the least powerful and the most vulnerable, what would I want? I concluded that while I wanted to live and be safe, for that to happen, it would be best for no one to have a gun. I also wanted all those around me to live and be safe. The risk to others from guns in the house was greater than the risk to others and me without one. I then took another approach using an adaptation of the crisis conceptual nursing model, which is a mechanism I've used to assess disaster risk and planning within nursing. And that is the table that you see. When considered within a framework, it's easier to see that there are actions that can be taken, provided the public or the individual is willing to help and do so. And none of these actions actually necessarily would require then taking a gun away from a person who's considered to be a rational person, a nonviolent person. That is not to say that you wouldn't look at the incidents and say, who are the people that are likely to commit crimes? For example, we know that people that abuse their spouses are more likely to also kill their spouses. So would you want somebody that abuses a spouse to actually have a gun? And it seems clear that the compassionate answer is no, you would not. So let's consider the moral dilemma. Do we accept the status quo? Do we actively advocate for a national change in gun laws? Or do we decline the right to bear arms and encourage others to do the same? Sometimes the compassionate decision must begin by individuals making the decision for themselves. There really are only a few political alternatives. One is to accept the status quo. Two, actively advocate for a change in the gun laws. And three, decline the right to bear arms. I do not have to see repealing the Second Amendment as let me rephrase this. I personally don't see repealing the Second Amendment as practical or feasible. I don't see it happening in this country. So we could spend a lot of time trying to make that happen, but if we're spending a lot of time working on something that we know is not feasible and isn't going to happen, then what we're really doing is spending time not solving the problem. And the problem is too many people are injured and die due to accidents or due to unintended incidents. And then sometimes they happen because we know that there's a policy in place that is bad. Fifth, we have to make a decision. A moral decision occurs when the intellect and the will come together, but without action serves little purpose. You have to act for yourself. And then you have to invite others to join you. Once I made the decision to decline the right to bear arms, it was time to act. A moral decision occurred because my intellectual abilities, my intellectual beliefs, and my will came together. The same could be said of people that have beliefs about other significant policy issues. And then you have to act, and if you want to change the policy, you must engage the public as a whole. Policymakers will only act when there is sufficient public interest for them to do so and sufficient public support for them to do so. I don't think that there is any of us in this current era that believes that our policymakers have the courage of their own convictions. They have the courage of social media. They fear, to an extent, us voting them out of office. And sometimes they act on policies because they fear the people that give them money more than they fear us. But is fear really how we want to get them to move toward compassion? And I would argue that it is not. That there must be a better way to persuade them to right action. And finally, we need to evaluate our outcomes. It is the final step to determine if the choice and the action was effective. Only time will tell as it relates to many policies. You have to wait and see. So I, as a human being, could pledge that I'm never going to own a gun. I could pledge that I am going to go out and try to convince other people to do the same. And you might convince one or two people, but eventually to see a large change, you either have to have a massive social movement or you need to change policy. But for now, we could consider that when it comes to human dignity, we are given all manner of rights in the United States that we can choose to decline. And if enough people choose to decline a right, it will eventually become the culturally accepted norm. So we could decline the right to participate in war. We could decline the right to take actions that cause poverty in our country. We do not have to shop at the store that we know pays a wage that is not a living wage. We do not have to hire the cheapest person that comes by that isn't a union worker, even though we know that person is not even getting their Social Security paid, or they're not even getting their taxes paid and they're being paid under the table. That's a moral decision on our part. We can decline to participate in the death penalty. We can decline to own a gun. We can decline to say that suicide is an option when things are not going well, or that we will not, and in another sense, we can decline to be part of the problem that defines mental health and insurance and its policy as separate from physical health. It is one body. And yet, as healthcare providers, we allow this process to continue where we know that there is inequality in treatment if somebody has a mental illness versus a physical illness. We can decline the right to have abortions. So I can decline my right to have a gun even though I have a legal right to have it. I can decline my right to have an abortion even though I know I have a legal right to do so. But we must eventually take a stand. So let us end with compassion, the sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it. What if all policy showed a desire to alleviate the distress of others? What does it mean to be compassionate when we see others in distress and know that proposed policies are causing that distress?